this is going to be a book someday. And right now it's scene cards everywhere. And so that's what's going on behind me there. And then, oh yeah, I guess on my wall, I've got my cool little Army stuff, my Stetson and saber and a guide on there. So that's what's going on.
Yeah,
I
no,
like
most
your
definitely.
guitars though.
Yeah, I mean, I see those cards. I got to ask right off the bat, have you always written that way?
So I have the way I've written is probably the technical term is called catastrophic. So it is very much an organic. I can't really plot, and so I write, and as I write, I try and figure out how to make things harder for the protagonist, how to up the stakes, and then when I'm pretty close to having a rough draft, or I get to a point where I get stuck, there's a great book called Save the Cat that was originally written by a guy who does screenplays. And so I take those cards and kind of it lays out what the beat should be in a 3-act story. And so I try and lay my stuff on top of that afterwards. But there have been many occasions where my wife, we've been married 23 years, we're high school sweethearts. And so she knew me the entire time I was trying to be a writer. And so there are many times where I get to a point in the book where my head is kind of like this and they're buried in the note cards, and she'll come in and she's like, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "I'm here and I got to get here and I don't know how to get here." And so I wish I could say these cards on the floor are an abnormality, but that's pretty much how I roll.
And so those are like the seeds of, I mean, you haven't written anything yet. You literally map it all out on these cards.
So that's what a professional would do. I actually have, what I do is I write first, and then I get to a point where I get stuck, and then I come back and do the scene cards for them. And then what Save the Cat does is it tells you in a 3-act structure, here are the beats that are supposed to have in each. And so I have those beats as one color index card, and then I put my scenes on the other one. And it's helpful because you can, move them around and try and figure out what goes where. And then I'll keep kind of a scene bullpen of stuff that I think that'll be cool, but I don't know where it goes in the book yet. And I'll make those a different color and have them there. And believe me when I tell you, it sounds a whole lot more organized than it is. It's a train wreck, straight up train wreck, but that's how I roll.
Yeah, crazy. I mean, we all have this podcast is teaching anyone anything. It's just there's really no one way to go about this. Elliot Ackerman, we had him on, and he literally rewrites his novel every single, I mean, from beginning to end, he rewrites the entire, so he writes 5 novels.
That's crazy.
Yeah, for one book. I gotta ask, like I said, I'm not sure if that's how it began for you, but how did you mentioned this? What was the name of the book you said? The screenwriting book?
It's called Save the Cat. Save the Cat.
Yeah. I mean, a big influence on me when I first started writing a couple of years ago was On Writing by Stephen King.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting how
book.
How we can go back to these books and how they can help us, especially when our fucking heads in our, we're stuck like this. How did you get introduced to that book? How did you get introduced to this way of writing? It seems like you kind of got a history. Kind of walk us through it.
Yeah. So it kind of goes along, I guess, with my writing history. And I like to tell folks I'm an overnight success, in that it took 17 years and 3 books that didn't sell to finally sell my first book in a 2-book deal. So completely overnight success. And I think a lot of that was going through and figuring out my writing process. Like you mentioned, the guy who writes 5 books, like Kyle Mills, who writes now the Mitch Rapp series for Vince Flynn, since Vince Flynn passed away. He writes a 42,000 word outline before he writes every book. So it's basically like half his novel. And so I have, for my entire career, tried to be better at outlining and just couldn't. And I started trying to get better at my craft. I went back and got an MFA in writing popular fiction. I started attending Thriller Fest, which is a fantastic conference if you've never been to that, for writers in New York.
Sorry, can I stop you there real quick? Yeah. You said an MFA in popular fiction?
Yeah, so it's this fantastic MFA program in Seton Hill University, not Seton Hall, Seton Hill, little liberal arts college.
I don't think Seton Hall has that.
No. And it's a low residency program, and it's unabashedly genre focused. And so when you are accepted, they pair you your thesis is your novel that you write during the program, and they pair you with a faculty member who publishes in the genre that you want to write in. And so it was incredibly helpful, again, because it's genre focused, and it taught you, I think, which is one of the things that's critical for a writer, is this thing around close reading, right? Like, so you read the book the first time for enjoyment, and the second time is when you go back through, and Stephen King, great example on writing when he talks about that, is picking the book apart and saying, how does a writer do what he does? And so one of big influences on me is Vince Flynn and his Mitch Rapp series. And I actually took one of his books, and I can't remember the name of it, and carted out every scene and had a different color for every protagonist, you know. And then I put it on my bedroom wall, which my wife was less than thrilled about. But we lived in a small house at the time, and I could just stare at it. And when you step back and you see it all on the wall, you're like, okay, here's where he introduces the antagonist, right? Here's the second point of view. And you can start to see like pacing take shape. And so there's a huge amount, I think, you learn from picking apart how other writers do it. But then you have to find your process, right? And I'm more of an organic writer. And there's a great guy named Stephen James that wrote a book called Story Trumps Structure. And so what he talks about is what I do is writing more organically, where you're getting to the end of a chapter and you say, you know, you kind of ask yourself a series of questions like, how can I make this harder for my protagonist? How can I raise the stakes? What are the questions that I asked in the last chapter that haven't been answered yet? And you kind of use that as a template to get through your first draft. But then what I found in my MFA program, we talked quite a bit about screenwriting as well, is I needed some sort of structure to lay back over top of that first draft once I had it. And so because of that, the Save the Cat book was really good because he writes from this ironclad, these are the things that have to be in it. In fact, the reason why it's called Save the Cat is he says, you know, any good screenplay within the first, and I can't remember how many minutes, say 15 minutes, the protagonist does something kind for somebody, like he saves the cat, right? Okay. And so he has these beats in there. And so what was super helpful for me is to take this really rough, loosey-goosey kind of fluid first draft and then drop kind of a structure on top of that to say, okay, do I have the inciting event where it needs to be? Is the break between act one and act two? And so for me, that helped kind of bridge the gap from the incredibly creative process that's the first draft to, okay, now I actually got to knuckle down and turn this into something for the second or third draft.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to agree with you 100% when you go back to saying when you were living in the small house and you had on the bedroom wall. What I did for my, I wrote a novella, and I didn't take, I've been a touring musician my whole life, but I've been a reader. And the way I, have always written music was, there's a blueprint already. The Beatles already gave us the blueprint. I'm not going to break the
chord
mold.
Progressions and stuff like that.
Verse, chorus, bridge, whatever.
Yep.
I asked you specifically when you said the MFA in popular fiction, and then you went on to say genre. When I wrote the novella, it was a boxing novella, but what I did was I took The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. And I just went through it paragraph by paragraph. And I'm like, this is how he structured. This is how you write a novella. Just like you said, you're able to step back and see how it actually looks structure wise. That's pretty dope.
That's the part, right, where I feel like we as craftsmen, you have to pull apart what they actually did, right? Because the first time it hits you and it's just magic and you're like, man, how did they do that? And then the second part is you're taking away kind of those rose-colored glasses and you're peeking behind the curtain and how did they actually do that? You talk about being a musician. So I'm a terrible guitar player, and that
do you play guitar?
Very, very badly. Like, if
okay, well, you can see the guitars behind you.
Yeah,
most definitely.
Yeah. That's what I was checking out, your guitars.
Yeah.
So in my
I got a Gibson
book,
SG and a Gibson ES 339.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. So in my first book, I used it quite a bit in that my character, Matt Drake, had some PTSD issues. And the way that he dealt with it was through playing guitar. And when I learned guitar, maybe like most people, is that you start with very simple chord progressions. And the guy that was teaching me did a lot of Eagles songs because they're very deceptively simple chord progressions, right, on the surface. But then when you get in the next layer and you're like, holy crap, what all are they doing there? But
Don, you
on the
just won a
surface,
lot
it's
of
like,
fans by giving an Eagles
yes.
reference on the podcast. Trust me.
Oh man, I love the Eagles. It's all over. It's all over the first book.
Yeah, I love
And
it. I
it's
love it. I
still,
love it.
but that's what it is, right? It looks very, very simple on and, you know, when you're just looking at the chord structure, like G, A, C, D, and E minor in there for kick, like how hard can this be? And then when you see what they do from an art standpoint, I think the same thing applies to writing, right? There's the part where you marvel at it, and then the part where you try and pick it apart and see how do the masters do what they do.
So if you don't mind me asking, let's rewind the
Yeah,
tape back a little bit.
sure.
Where did you grow up? Where are you from? You know, what brought you to writing eventually?
Yeah, so I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio originally, and loved writing all through school, and and I went to college at the Ohio State University, and and probably the only guy who was admitted as a poli sci guy and switched to electrical engineering. And so
Okay.
I always had that craziness even through college, where I was still working on a novel inside. In my senior year, we had to take this technical writing class, like writing for engineers, right? And so the very first assignment the instructor gives us, and it's a softball assignment, and he says, write about something you built. And so all my dutiful classmates write about a circuit board or something they built. And I wrote this funny story about, you know, building a treehouse when I was a kid. And so didn't think anything of it, turned it in. And so the next time we come to class and the instructor gets up and he's like, I don't usually do this, but one of your papers reminded me as a kid and I want to read it to you. And he read me mine. And I'm like, this is my crowning moment in my collegiate career. And I majored in the wrong thing. And so I did, you know, after that, I went into the Army and continued to write on the side and never finished the novel, wrote some short stories and stuff. In about 2001, I decided to get serious about it. And I think, you know, one of the things, and would love to hear your opinion on this too, when people ask about like what's important in being a writer, how do you do it? I think, you know, you don't have to have an MFA. In fact, many of the folks in my genre who are very successful don't, but there are some basic things you need to understand about the mechanics of writing, about what makes a novel a novel. And so I finally took, and this was, I'm dating myself, like I said, back in 2001, Writer's Digest, the magazine, offered these online courses, right? Like this is the novel course, this is the short story. And so I took a couple of those, wrote my first novel, got an agent, it didn't sell, and we parted ways. Wrote my second novel, got an agent, it didn't sell. And so that's when I had the GI Bill, and I said, you know what, I could go back, and I'd heard about this MFA program that was, you know, like I said, unabashedly genre fiction. And I was like, I'll go try that. So I wrote my third novel in there, then took that to Thriller Fest, which is an incredible conference. And that's the other thing I'll tell folks is that even in an MFA program, you're surrounded by students who want to learn and great professors and stuff. But if you want to meet the people who are actually doing this for a living and are successful as writers and stuff, or editors of things, like the conferences are invaluable, right? Because if you go to a conference and for a beer or two at the end of the day, as everybody's hanging around in the bar, you're getting a master's class on writing, on the business of writing, on the stuff. And, you know, that to me was another pivotal inflection point, I think, in my writing career. And that's where I met my agent for the first time, but she turned that novel down and said, go home and write a better book. And so after an appropriate period of sulking, I went home and wrote my fourth book, and that's the one that ended up selling. But if you know, people say, well, what about the first three? And I was like, no, the first three are exactly where they belong, in a trunk somewhere, never to be seen again. Because, you know, you think about how writing works. If you want to be a carpenter, you don't go to your garage the first time and create this, you know, masterful piece of furniture. Like you build something and it sucks a little bit, and you get a little bit better, and you build something and sucks. And there's that whole, you know, any kind of craft, there's that whole apprentice, journeyman kind of master thing. But we think in writing a lot of time, well, how hard can it really be? I should be able to write the first time and it sells. And I think that's part of the, honestly, the tension in writing too, is because there's one part that's perseverance, right? Like I'm also a big fantasy fan. And Brandon Sanderson, I think, wrote 13 novels before he got his first one and sold it. And so there's certainly a perseverance aspect. But the second part of that is that if you're writing the same novel over and over again and you're not changing anything or figuring out why the other ones didn't sell, you're probably not going to get any further ahead than you were in the others. And that's the tricky part, right? And so for me, the two things I tell folks from my humble experience is perseverance, and then finding like a good critique partner that is hopefully a little bit farther along the path than you are, that can help shape some of that. Hey man, you're almost here there. But Nick Petrie is a great example. He writes that awesome series with Peter Ash, and his first book is called The Drifter, and we share the same agent. And when I was getting ready, I'd met him at Thriller Fest. When I was getting ready to submit to my agent, he offered to take a look at my book. And so, I was all pumped. I thought I was ready to send it to her, and I sent it to him. And he came back and said, "Here's some great things." But then he said something that just punched me right between the eyes. And he's like, "You need another edit. Like this, you haven't worked hard enough on this. There are more things to take out." And he was good enough to take like one chapter and show me what he would have done. And I was so pissed off because I'm like, "You just don't understand my voice. You don't." And so I sulked for a little bit. And then I thought, you know what? The last 3 books that I tried to do on my own didn't sell. Here's a guy who is a very successful writer that went out of his way to help me. And I started to look at it, and I was like, you're right. And that's why I love that On Writing book, going back to the Stephen King thing, because he does that, right? He shows you his first draft, and then he shows you an edit, and his, I think, is, second draft is first draft minus 20% or whatever, right? That was exactly me. And I was like, Nick is right. I got to go back and do another edit before it's done. And those are the things that I think it helps, whether it's an MFA program, whether it's a conference, whether it's a good critique partner. Those are hard things to learn. You can be very, very perseverant, but if you don't have somebody that can point you towards those things, that's really, really hard to learn on your own, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing you talk, it seems like you're a pretty confident man to begin with. And again, rejection's a huge thing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm gonna give you my personal experience in the sense of the novella
Yeah.
I wrote. I got 73 rejections. And
Nice.
but none of them were, I didn't get any feedback. It was all
Yeah.
just,
Yeah. It's
whatever.
brutal.
And at the time, I'm like you said, like, well, they're just idiots. Like they don't
Yeah.
see this
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
beautiful piece of art. Well, no, it wasn't meant to
Yep.
be. I want to
Yep.
again kind of go back.
Sure.
When you joined the Army,
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming you said you went right out of high school or I'm sorry, after college you went into the
Yeah.
Army, right?
Yep. Yep.
What
Yep.
was how were you writing when you were serving? Were you writing at all during that time? I mean, how quickly? Also, what year? When?
Sure.
Put it in perspective, I was a freshman in high school on 9/11, on
Okay.
9/11.
Yep.
And
Yep.
9/11, I was 15 miles west of Manhattan in northern New
Wow.
Jersey. My father worked in
Wow.
the towers from 1990 to 1999.
Oh my
I mean, I was in the
gosh.
top of those buildings for, a
Yep.
dozen times. So I'm assuming you were part of, again,
Yeah.
talk about your writing during that whole
Sure.
time.
Sure. So I went to school on an Army ROTC scholarship, and then went in 97, I was commissioned, and I was lucky enough to get flight school. And then at flight school, you compete for the aircraft you wanted. And I was lucky enough again to get Apaches. And it is hard to have a bad day when you're flying Apache helicopters. Like your job is to go out and blow stuff up. And who doesn't want to go out and blow stuff up? And so I went and was flying Apaches, and in September 11th, I was actually at Fort Hood. And then shortly after that, in 2004 to 2005, I deployed to Afghanistan. And so I'd actually written my first book, or finished my first book, while we were in Germany, and worked on my second book while we were in Afghanistan. I think I finished it shortly thereafter. But Afghanistan was very much a pivotal moment for me, both in my life and my writing career. In that on June 28th, 2005, I was a part of this operation to try and go rescue 4 SEALs who we had lost contact with. And the helicopter that I was trying to escort, which was a Chinook, was and had a bunch of SEALs in it as well. That was the QRF, or Quick Reactionary Force, was shot down, and there wasn't anything I could do to stop it. And it was, it's that moment in time, and not to be trite about it, but the best analogy I can think of is that imagine you are a pro football player and you spent your entire career getting ready for the Super Bowl, and you get to play, and on the first play you fumble the ball, and then you're out of the game for the rest of it. And that's what it felt like, was that at that moment, the thing that was most important that I'd spent my entire career training for went completely sideways, and there was nothing I can do about it. And so I really latched on to that experience and brought it into my first book, in that my protagonist, Matt Drake, in Without Sanction, which is my first book, is he works for the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, as a case officer. And so what that means is, much like with the CIA as a case officers, their job is to go and recruit and run what in the intelligence community you call assets. And when I was an FBI agent, we called sources. And so he, at the beginning of the book, he has had an operation that's gone tragically wrong, and it cost his asset his life, and it crippled his best friend. And so that's where he's starting with in the beginning of the book, is where very much I was when I got out of the Army. And so I wrote my second book while I was in the Army, got out, and then, like I said, wrote my third book while I was in the FBI and going to get my MFA. And so those things very much, I was writing at the same time, in my spare time when I would do it, but those things very much shaped who I was going to write and what I was going to write about. A really good friend of mine, like I said, I think Nick Petrie, I tend to attribute anything that sounds really smart to Nick Petrie, because he's really smart.
Should we have him on the podcast?
Yes, you should have him on the program.
Yeah.
He's a great guy. But he said, when you're coming to write genre fiction, what you want to do is write something that's the same but different. And so there are already a really, Brad Taylor and Mark Graney and whoever else write fantastic books in this genre. And we don't need another Brad Taylor book, because Brad Taylor writes Brad Taylor books really well. And so what you want to do is write something that fits into that genre, but is different. And so when I started looking at what was out there and what the different protagonists did, I kind of drew on my experience and built this guy who was the same but different. So for instance, I write my books in first person. And the reason why I do that is because Nelson DeMille's John Corey series was such a huge influence on me. And he has this, I remember reading one of his first one, which is called Plum Island. And he's got this super witty, super funny protagonist. And I was like, you know what? I would read about that guy going to the grocery store, because he's so, that voice, right, brings you back. And not a lot of people did that. So I grabbed hold of that. And then there are a ton of folks in this genre who are like Mitch Rapp. We talked before about what Kyle Mills read, that works for the CIA as an assassin, or Brad Taylor has Pike Logan, who's a counterterrorism operative.
I love all these names. Again, is that a common theme in this genre?
Yeah, I think it is. I think you gotta have the protagonist that sounds like he's a rough, tough guy. I think is part of it too.
It's funny. I mean, it's just they're all one syllable. It's just funny.
Like calling the dog, it's got to be one syllable. It's got to just roll out of the tongue.
Yeah.
And so I very much went and said, like, what can I do that leverages my background but brings something the same that's different? And if you kind of alluded it to before, I was an Apache pilot. I deployed in Afghanistan. I was an FBI special agent and a SWAT guy for a while. And it wasn't, I didn't do really cool things, but I got to meet really cool people. And so what I've done over the years is kind of pull bits and pieces of their stories together. Several of my closest friends in the company I work with now are veterans of the Ranger Regiment. And so that's an Army unit that's part of special operations, and they have something very specific that governs them. It's called the Ranger Creed. And to you and I, it would sound like an HR mission statement or something like that. But to them, it's something that they internalize that guide their actions, both as a Ranger and once they leave the Ranger Regiment. And there's a stanza that says, "Never will I leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy," right? And that, again, sounds real good. We're like, yeah, we could get behind that. But they take it a step further in that's kind of this pledge that they make to each other that says, when you go into harm's way, I can't guarantee that you will come back alive, but I will make sure you come back. And in fact, one of my good friends is a former member of Delta Force, and he was in the tragedy that was Black Hawk Down. And he told me a story about that when the helicopters were shot down and they knew that the folks inside were dead and that they were under fire from the enemy, they still stayed until they got every last service member out of that helicopter, even though they knew that they weren't alive anymore, even though they were taking fire, because that is the vow that they made to each other, that never will leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. And so I made my protagonist a ranger, and the ranger creed figures very, very prominently in my first book, in Without Sanction. And so those are the kind of things that I feel like if you do, you don't have to have by any means, a super cool background to be a good writer. There were plenty of folks, Vince Flynn was a bartender, and Brad Thor was a travel writer before, and Mark Graney did different things, but he never served in the military. But I think by grabbing that and bringing it in, maybe that's what helps set you apart.
Yeah, no, I mean, we had Mark on the podcast, and I haven't released the episode yet, but I mean, he would put, he did 10 years of jack shit before, and it's interesting. Again, I'm in that that era of my life where I'm like in my early 30s. I'm running this dog walking business, but I am, as soon as I finished writing my first novel essentially last night, in the sense that it goes to my editor this week.
Nice. Congratulations, man.
Yeah, it's dope. But to go on to what you're talking about is, it's, you made it sound like it's easy for you to write about what you know, but to make it different, right?
Yeah.
Same but different. I wrote a book about a fictional rock and roll band. I've lived in vans. I've torn on buses. I've done it all. But there's books out there that have done these fictional rock and roll bands. I did it where I did my own research. I was grabbing these books. I'm like, what are they doing? How can I do the same thing but different? That's a huge thing. That's huge.
Absolutely. And I was talking with my editor earlier today, who is also, so Tom Colgan is my editor. He's also Mark Graney's editor, and Mark Cameron, who does the Tom Clancy Senior series. And he said, you can look at a really great writer doesn't have to have that background. And sometimes, in fact, that background can be a detriment, because as you were maybe alluding to, you could have relied on your own experience, but you still went out and researched it because your own experience has some blind spots in it, I would imagine. And so you wanted to go out and look beyond your blind spots. And a good writer anchors you with those little bits of veracity that you're like, what it smells like when you're up on stage with the band members talking, things like that nobody else would know. And you take that and you pull the reader in, and then you've got them and they believe it, right? Because that's what our job is at the bottom line, to be writers, is to make the readers believe it. And so if you can add that little bits of veracity, that's what, when I have particular scenes, I'll send it to my friends who have done cool things and ask them to read it. And most of the time, if they'll let me, I'm like, don't email me the answers to my questions. Let's get on the phone and talk about it. Because a lot of times as you're going back and forth, it might not even be a question you ask, but there'll be some crazy little detail, and you're like, I got to use that. That's so good, and it grounds the scene so well, and it wasn't something you even intended. But like you said, because you're willing to go do the research and go talk to people who have actually done it, you can grab that, and now it goes from kind of that hazy scene that's in your mind to like it's grounded and it's real, and the reader believes it.
Yeah, and we had Michelle Gallen is another author we had on, and it's so fresh in my head because I produce this podcast too, so I make all these clips and I listen back to everything, and I was listening back to our podcast with her today, and she's like, what people never talk about or write about in a book? They're like, when someone's taking a shit. Like you never, you know what I'm saying? Like there are things that are just kind of get generalized in fiction, writing in general, that we kind of just gloss over. So my question for you is really, are you the kind of writer? I mean, do you talk about, the grade of the bullet? Do you talk about the finite things? In my book, I went overboard. I'm talking string gauges. I'm talking, amplifier models and tube numbers. How do you balance that?
That's a super hard thing to balance, because I'm not a gear guy. Like I use the stuff that was given to me, but I don't have too much of a closet full of stuff. And so for me, like I'll answer it this way. Besides the different writers that we talk about, I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s, and the things that influenced me the most besides book were movies, and specifically movies like Die Hard or Lethal Weapon or Bad Boys. And what I loved about that, like if you look at Die Hard from a veracity standpoint, okay, so there's a lot of things in there that you could point to say, somehow he straps the explosives to the chair and he drops it in the elevator and explodes at just the right floor and takes those guys out. But there's enough there where it's not, say, Fast and Furious, where those movies are almost like comic books or cartoons because they're so beyond the belief. You know, you got Rock that's holding
like
onto a helicopter
movies.
on one. Yeah, exactly. Like Kung Fu movies. And so that's where I try to, or you have the other extreme that are documentaries, right? That are completely true. Everything in it is valid. I try and write more of Die Hard, is that it's enough there where you'll give me a pass, right? So when I gave it, when I gave Without Sanction to my Delta Force friend, there's a scene in there where there's a hey-ho, a high altitude, high opening jump sequence that happens. And so I had him read through it, and he's like, yep, this is good, change this would never happen. I'm like, okay, but was it a good story? He's like, it was a really good story. I'm like, it's staying, because that's at the end of the day, right? I'm not writing a how-to manual. I'm not working a documentary. I'm trying to write Die Hard, and I'm trying to write something that's really fun, that's fast, that the dialogue is great, the relationships, and maybe the weapons and stuff are right, but I'm not, me personally, I'm not going to go into hours and hours of research to figure out the grain of the bullet and how many feet per minute and stuff it's coming out of the barrel. Some people can do that really well. Some people don't do it as well, and it drags down the pacing, right? And what I keep coming back to is our primary job is to entertain. And if you pull the reader out, because there's so many technical aspects, there's so much that, then we stopped entertaining them. And I'm always going to default to Die Hard.
I mean, that should be your new Twitter profile. I'm trying to write Die Hard.
Trying to write Die Hard, one novel at a time.
Well, I mean, why not? I mean, it's just,
yeah.
I guess what it comes down to for me, and I think you're probably going to agree, is you also have to enjoy what it is that you're writing about, and enjoy the process of it. So if you're spending all this time fucking researching things that you don't really give a shit about to begin with, to shove in your book, are you as a reader going to even enjoy it? You know, I mean, why even do that? Why go that length?
That's absolutely right. And that is so The Outside Man comes out tomorrow, and then I also am lucky enough to write in the Tom Clancy world. And my first Tom Clancy book, it's called Target Acquired, comes out in June. And so that one was I took a harder look at it, because in the original Tom Clancy stuff, he was very, very much detail oriented. And there's one, I think it's Dead of Honor, where you're an electron moving through a nuclear bomb, and you're seeing all of that stuff. And it was, at first I was like, how much is this going to make me alter my writing style? Because I want to stay true. To me, it's like getting invited to write, in the Star Wars universe, right? Like there's this huge canon, and, giants have come before you, and now you're given this opportunity to do it. And my editor was really, really good about it. And he's like, look, I don't want you to channel Tom Clancy. He's like, I want you to bring what you do to this universe and stay true to the characters and such that are there. But he's like, I picked you because I like your other books, and I want that style in this universe. And that gave me a lot more confidence to do it. And then I also went back and read, Tom Clancy was kind of my gateway drug to the military thriller universe, right? I was probably 13 or 14 when I read Storm Rising. And so I went back as an adult and read a bunch of his older books, and actually wrote in my journal, here are the things that I liked about it, here are the things that jazzed me, and then tried to see, what could I do that was the same but different for that too, that says this is what a person expects when they pick up a book that says Tom Clancy on it, but here's what I bring that's the unique me, that maybe we can figure out a way to marry those two things together.
Yeah, a couple of things. First, quick question. Did you ever meet Tom?
No, I did not. So Mark Graney did. Mark Graney.
About it, yeah. He had a story for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I'm new to Tom Clancy. My father was huge into that stuff.
Yep.
What was the book you mentioned specifically? What was it called?
Yeah, so it was called Red Storm Rising, and that one is a unique one because it's not part of it's a standalone Clancy book. So it doesn't have any of the characters that are in his other ones. It was about and I'm a kid, like I said, a kid that grew up in the 80s where we used to think we were going to lob nuclear missiles back and forth at Russia. And that's what that book is. It's kind of World War III, where the Russians invade, that kind of thing. But the probably the book folks are most familiar with is Hunt for the Red October, which was the first one that was made into a movie with Alec Baldwin as Jack Ryan and everything. So yeah, it was when my editor offered me the chance to do that. It was about a year ago this time, because I just turned in edits for The Outside Man, and we were having our
Okay, so you're
editorial
new to this whole world. Again,
Yeah, this is my first one.
Yeah, and this is new to me, that the idea that there can be an author who created a whole and then they pass away, and then people can come into that. I can only relate it to the comic book world, really.
To comic books, or like I said, I equate it to Star Wars, right? There's huge number of Star Wars novels, and you know, some of it's canon, some of it's not canon, where writers have been invited to come into that universe and pick up those characters and write with them. And so our editor, Tom Colgan, is kind of the gatekeeper for that, right? So he is the one, you know, when I wrote, and this is kind of the funny thing, because you can bring too much of yourself to it, right? And so in Target Acquired, I wrote this scene, and my editor's like, he's like, you would, you know, Jack Ryan Jr. would never. I was like, well, Matt would talk that way to him, and he's like, you got to go back and fix that, right? And so he's the gatekeeper between them that says, here is what stays true to the Clancy universe, and here's how far you can go, but you still got to stay within those guardrails.
Yeah.
And kind of the other crazy thing about the Clancy universe is there's two different series that happen in parallel. And so Mark Cameron writes the Tom Clancy series that has Jack Ryan Sr., who is his primary protagonist, who's now an older guy that's been president for a while. And then I write his son, who is, if you know the Amazon series Jack Ryan, he's about that age in the books. Well, the books go like this. So his book, my book, his book, my book. And so when I was writing my first one, the writer before me, Mike Madden, fantastic writer, gave me his book, and I read it, and I'm like, yeah, this is good. I can work with this. And then I knew Mark Cameron was working on something, but I was like, I read his synopsis. There's nothing there that's going to do it. Well, he did something at the very end of my book that I found, or at the end of his book, that I found out about like 70,000 words into my book. And I'm like, I can't believe you did that. You just took this character and now I got to go back and do it. And so it wasn't as catastrophic as I thought it was, but we kind of had that good laugh because our book staggered. So I told him, you know, at the end of my book, your character has a stroke and he's in a wheelchair. So good luck. We'll see what you do with that. But it is kind of crazy where you have the same characters that kind of drift back and forth between the two series.
And is there a crossover or a spillover audience? Do you get fans from when you write these? They will now check out your other writing. Do you find that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the big draws of being asked to do it. And I talked with when my editor Tom said, hey, if you want to do this, I'm going to set up a call with you and Mark Graney. And Mark, the guy that I don't know if you know Mark other than when you interviewed him, but he is exactly like how he is in a podcast and a real person, like the nicest guy in publishing, very soft spoken, like very encouraging. And so when we started the call, he's like, okay, I'm not going to tell you to do this because it's really hard. And here are all the things. And so he started going through them. And then at the end of it, he's like, you have to do this. You have to do this. And one of the reasons why he said that is exactly that. Like he was writing the Gray Man series before anyway, but how many of his readers went from Tom Clancy to the Gray Man series and how that helped out his book. So for sure, that's one of the huge draws of being asked to do that.
Yeah. Wait, we're going to edit this part out. Reba's book. Let me put her in the crates. Hold on one sec.
No worries.
And we're back. Yeah. So, well, is there pressure from this community? I'm sure it's a diehard community that
Yeah.
of people who, I mean, yeah, I mean, are people throwing jabs at you when you're not doing what they want you to do?
Yeah, and I'm in the honeymoon period right now because it's my first book. But another friend of mine who you should have on too is Josh Hood, and so he writes in the Robert Ludlum universe. And so he did something really smart. Is he went to some of the fan boards for Robert Ludlum and kind
Oy
of
vey.
stalked them at first, and then yeah, and then he actually went out and he said, "Hey, I'm writing one of these books. What are the things you guys have wanted to see and haven't seen?" And he got a ton of feedback, and some of it he ended up using. And so I talked to Mark Graney and Mark Cameron and Mike Madden about that a little bit, and they said, on the whole, most people are pretty good. You'll have some crazy people, like even now when my book that comes out tomorrow, The Outside Man, we were also advertising that, hey, I'm the new Tom Clancy guy, and I can't tell you the number of awesome Facebook posts I got from people that says Tom Clancy's dead. You can't be writing with him. You're not a co-writer. I'm like, thank you for that. I
Oy
appreciate
vey.
your kindness there. But they said, they've said for the most part that the experience is pretty positive, because I think, again, like any great series, fans they don't want it to die, right? That's why we were, again, 80s kid that grew up with Star Wars and then had to wait for half my life for them to come out again, right? And now, I take my
Now you
kids
can't
to
get
them and
enough of
everything.
them. Jesus.
Now you can't get
Yeah.
enough of them. You got them coming out left and right and
Yeah.
stuff. But it is like, as a fan, you don't want something good to die, and so you might give them a hard time. I think maybe it's part of it, but for the most part, they're great fans that just want to see the characters live on. And so I think if we can do that, we're probably doing our job.
Yeah. Are you still a fan of this genre? Do you read these books in your spare time, or do you read Shakespearean, literature?
I am a fan of the genre, but
Yeah.
what I found is I can read less and less of it in my spare time. And the reason, and that isn't because I dislike it any or not like it as much anymore. It's because we're all writing similar things. And so Brad Taylor's a good friend of mine. His last book was Hunter Killer, was fantastic, and I am dying to read his new book, which is called American Trader. But I know it has China as a centerpiece in it, and I'm doing something, I think, with China in my next book. And so I'm very, very cautious about reading it because it's so easy to become derivative, and most of us think alike. That's why we write in that genre. So I'm also, in addition to thrillers, I read a bunch of other genres, but I'm a huge, huge fantasy fan. And one of my favorite writers is Jim Butcher, who writes the Harry Dresden Files stuff. And and it's probably about as far from traditional espionage thrillers and stuff as you can get. But going back again to deconstructing how masters do things, he writes this series of books that has a wizard, but it's almost more like the beginning ones are like gumshoe detective kind of crime fiction stuff. And he is the master of ratcheting up the stakes every chapter, right? Every chapter he twists it a little more, every chapter. And so the last one I read of his that I really, really loved was called Peace Talks. And I did the same thing. Like, I read it through the first time, loved it, and then went back and read it through the second time. I'm like, how did he keep that much tension for an entire novel? Like,
Yeah.
what did he do to be able to do that? And so maybe that's one of the downsides, or the only downside of being able to write in this genre, is that I think you kind of have to start limiting yourself, just because you're like, I don't want to read what Brad's doing because I'm trying to do my own thing and I don't want to be influenced. Or I know Mark Graney, and he probably didn't tell you this because he's such a humble guy. He wrote this standalone book called Red Metal that pretty much revitalized there used to be in the late 80s this sprawling, like almost epic military thrillers that were the Red Storm Rising's example, where it was like these great power competitions, like reimagined a Korean War, reimagined. He just wrote that in his spare time in Red Metal, and hit the New York Times bestseller with it and crushed it. And I know he's writing another one right now with Rip Rawlings, and I'm like, I don't think I can read it. I think I've got to wait until I get a break from this, because he's a super smart guy. but all of our brains kind of track along. And I was like, I gotta nail down what I'm doing first. And I think maybe this was part of the Stephen King thing too, about not sharing your first drafts with anybody, right? Because it's such a tenuous thing right there, that if you share it with somebody, if you get feedback so much, you can kill it. And I think the same can be true is if you read something that's too close to what you're writing, right? Because you're comparing something that's very, very infantile in its draft form with something that's a finished project. And when you read those two, the dissonance, you're just going to look at what you're writing and you're like, this is trash, I got to throw it out. And so that may be one of the only downsides. The upsides is I get to meet these awesome folks. The downside is I can't read what they write as much as I used to.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And I mean, with me writing this rock and roll book, 2 books came out this year about fictional. There hasn't been a book about a fictional rock and roll band that anyone's given a shit about in 30 years. And 2 novels got published this year that were huge. I mean, people talking about them. But my thing is just so different that I was trying to be, one of the books is by David Mitchell. It's called Utopia Avenue. And I wanted to make sure that I wasn't like gonna just be morally crushed that he was just in. I also wanted to make sure that I wasn't writing the same things.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you find influence still from are you a fan of the action thriller movies that are coming out? Do you know anyone who writes these movies? Are you part of that?
I don't know anybody who writes the movies. What I do
or the
know,
TV
so you
shows.
Well, you should. So Jack Carr, you should have him on because he was on
Rogan. I've been trying to get him on ever since he got on Rogan. He kind of blew up.
Yeah, I can see that. But he's Mark Graney too. I'm sure he talked to you about the Gray Man, but Mark isn't writing the adaptation for it. Like he optioned it, and I think the Russo brothers are the ones who's writing it. Jack is actually involved and is writing the adaptation for the Terminal List as well, and so he does it. Another great guy you should have on, good friend of mine, is Chris Haughty, and so he debuted the same time as I did, and his debut was called Deep State. And so what makes Chris really interesting is he made his living as a screenplay writer in Hollywood for most of his life, and then transitioned to novel writing. And so he's been on the other side and has some really cool insight into what that's like versus writing a novel. And so I know that his book Deep State was optioned, and I think his follow-on is called Savage Road. And I don't know if that one's been optioned or not, but those are the 2 guys I know who have been in the business or who are working in it, but not me, unfortunately. I think that'd be a super fun thing to do, but it's interesting when you talk to Chris about it, he'll give you the real life thought. But his kind of take on it is that the novel writing community is so much more supportive and so much more welcoming than the folks who write screenplays. So
yeah, you saying, I mean, that makes complete sense to me. I mean, a lot of, for me, I mean, with books, there should be as many books as possible because there's so many things, but there's only so many movies that can get made.
Exactly right.
That's a whole different business.
Right.
I have someone in my family, my brother's brother-in-law, who's a big time writer for these Marvel movies.
Nice.
But that's a different thing. How much of your day, I mean, you mentioned you're writing about China. How much of your day do you watch the news at all? I mean, are you a big news junkie, CNN, Fox, whatever it is?
I'm a big news junkie, but I don't get it from watching. I do a lot. I listen to podcasts. I listen to one of the guys I like listening to is Hugh Hewitt because he brings on a lot of interesting people. And then I do a lot of reading, a lot of research on the internet, a lot of clicking on links and like, that's interesting, I bet. And so I've just got on my email folder, I've just got a folder that says research where I'm constantly dumping things I find into the internet on there. And so I don't watch a whole lot of TV, but I do consume a voracious amount of news for sure. And I think, some of the folks say that a thriller writer's job is to write something that beats the headlines or matches the headlines. I think I don't try and do that, but I think you want to write something that still feels contemporary, right? That feels like, yep, this is this didn't happen today, but I could see it happening in the future. Or I can kind of guess where this is going to go and stuff. And so I think to do that, you have to stay up on current events for sure.
Yeah, we had on Elliot Ackerman, and I don't know if you know him, and he just released a new book. I think it's called 2420 or something, and he's talking about thermonuclear wars and different with Bitcoin, and I mean, he's all, I mean, it's intense, it's crazy. So you say your third book is on the floor by you. How quickly are you able to pop these things out? I mean, do you have kind of your recipe now to do this?
Yeah, this is it's actually it's my third Matt Drake book that's on the floor, but it'll be my fourth book that I've written for this editor, because I wrote two Matt Drake books. So The Outside Man is what comes out tomorrow, and then Target Acquired is my Tom Clancy book, and then book number 4 is on the floor. And so right now I'm signed up to do 2 books a year, and so I do one of my books and one of the Tom Clancy books, which certainly compresses the timeline quite a bit. So you have to turn a book around basically in 6 months, because that's one of the things I talked to Mark Graney about. He wrote 2 books a year for a while, and Brad Taylor wrote 2 books a year. And they said, you can't really write 2 books at the same time. So what you really got to do is write a book in 6 months, be done, turn around and write another book in 6 months. And so that's where I am now. And this is the first time. So the book I just turned in, the Clancy book, I actually had maybe 9 months or something to write that. And so the book that I'm working on now, Matt Drake number 3, is due on July 15th. So this will be the first one where it's no kidding, 6 months. You got to go and bust that book out. And so it's harder. It's a lot harder. You have to be a lot more disciplined. But when I was talking with Brad Taylor about it, I asked him, I can't remember if I asked him or somebody at one of his signings, they said, hey, do you ever vacillate in your plots? And he's like, I couldn't afford to, because when I was writing, he's crazy. He wrote 2 books a year, and he would write a novella between each book as he was working on it. And he's like, I never had time. Yeah. And he's like, you had to have the idea and stick with it, or else you wouldn't get the book done on time. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. Call me back on July 15th, and if I'm still alive, then we can talk if I'm successful or not. So jury's still out on that one. We'll
crazy
see.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone has their own way of doing it. I'm already working on 2 new novels, and it's like, for me, I'm the kind of guy, I have to just, if it's in my head, I gotta get it down.
Nice.
Yeah, but you could also be Danielle Steele, and she writes 7 novels at a time.
Yes.
Yeah. There's all different ways to do this. All
different ways.
It's crazy. Don, this has been an absolute pleasure, man.
Absolutely.
I always kind of ask 2 kind of questions at the end of this. The first is, do you do any kind of social media? I know you said Facebook. How can people get in touch with you? How can they kind of link up with you?
Sure. I'm pretty active on Twitter and then Facebook as well. And my handle is Bentley Don B. So BENTLEY DONB. And then you can also go to my website, which is donbentley.books.com. So just DONBENTLEY books.com.
Okay, you said, are you on Instagram too, or just Twitter and Facebook?
I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah, just Twitter and Facebook.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, again, it's all those very different worlds, how people act. And it's interesting to see how when people are in both of those worlds, how they act in both of those worlds.
A little different in each one.
Yeah. I don't know. I forget. I don't know if you're in Ohio now, but the last question I always ask: where are people buying your books? Who do you like to kind of local rep your bookstores?
Yeah, so I've been in Texas off and on for the last 20 years, and I've been in Austin for the last 9.
Coming there now, right?
Half y'all are here, and the other half are house hunting. That's kind of what I tell people. So our local independent bookstore is called Book People, and it's fantastic. So I'm actually doing an event with them and Brad Taylor tomorrow for our kickoff. So Book People, and then there's also Murder by the Book that is in Houston, and then I'm doing an event with Poison Pen as well. All those independent bookstores, Joseph Beth is another one, are incredible. But my local one is Book People down in Austin.
I've spent a lot of time in Texas myself. I mean, I've played South by. Yeah, I played South by South.
Yeah, South by
6 times. I've played Houston. Awesome. I've never played Dallas. I love San Antonio though. I like San Antonio a lot.
Yeah. Those are good cities. Good cities.
Big people in San Antonio.
Are you coming back to South by when it's? I think they're saying it's going to be open this year. You gonna come back again?
Texas, y'all are just doing how it's America there. It's America. I'm a Jersey kid, so I'm a Jersey kid, and I'm not a political guy, but
yeah.
A year from now, we gotta get this. We gotta get going. Yeah.
No,
Don, what a pleasure, man. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Yeah, you as well. Thank you so much for having me.
Most definitely. I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Absolutely.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye. Cool. Thanks a lot, Don. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, man. That was a lot of fun, Michael.
Yeah, no, most definitely. I'll edit the Reba thing out.
Sure.
I probably will, I'd say I release one a week, so probably in 4 or 5 weeks, something like that.
Okay.
Let me do you have a personal email, or I can send all the links to you if you prefer? Let me just take that down. What's your email?
It's Bentley Don B. So BENTLEYDONB @gmail.com.
At Gmail. Okay, great. All right, cool. And I'll email you from the writing friction. Yeah, and I'll give you all the links and all that stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
All right, Don. Have enjoyed.
Yeah. It was great meeting you. Have a great night.
See you later. Bye-bye.
See ya.